recognize a number of wine aficionados in the room already. Thank you, Christine, for recording. It is a pleasure for me to welcome our speaker today, Teddy Chappell, a recent graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, where he defended his dissertation last year on the development of Tuscan wine as a cultural and commercial commodity in the 17th and 18th centuries in the Department of History. He now currently works at UPenn as an academic advisor. His research has explored how the Chianti, that is now world famous, emerged from an unlikely encounter between Florentine elites and the peasant sharecroppers in the surrounding countryside. There's a little more of a description, but I think we're going to hear about all of this work today, which I'm very excited about. So whenever you're ready, Teddy, you can take it away.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank everyone at the Torch Oxford Critical Food Studies Network for inviting me here today to talk a little bit about my work, as well as to everyone that is in attendance today. I would like to thank Maria, Ashley, and Christina in particular for helping organize this seminar. I'm especially excited to be presenting this research to a group in Oxford because it was there many, many years ago at this point that as an undergraduate studying abroad there that I became engrossed with the early modern period, which in turn led me to pursue a doctorate in history. I would love to be sharing a glass of Chianti with you all in person, but I think it is fitting in many ways to talk about this story to a distant audience, since the research itself revolves around the often uneven reception of goods and ideas that have traveled great distances. Anyway, here's to hoping that my research has a smoother voyage across the airwaves or whatever than 18th century Chianti, as we'll see. I'll pause here. Is the volume and everything good? Good, great. To start, I would like here. Next slide. To start, I would like to give an overview of the narrative of my research to better orient everyone, and also because I think fitting together this sometimes strange mix of sources into a narrative is one of the more important contributions of this research. As I was writing my conclusion almost a year ago, I realized that the best way to describe my dissertation research in the broadest sense is that it is a history of early modern Italians, and especially Tuscans' rationale for making good wine. Today, the question of why it is worthwhile to make good wine seems like an obvious one with a wide range of compelling answers, most of which involve around the increased potential for profit. The same can be said for Tuscany in the 19th century when Bettino Ricasoli, a prominent Tuscan politician in the newly unified Kingdom of Italy and the inventor of the modern formula of Chianti that we enjoy to this day, saw making better wine as a way to address many of Tuscany's problems, such as exporting improved wines to places like Britain could bring in money to help make up for the region's lack of industry, improve the lot of agricultural laborers who toiled to make it, and just as importantly, bring prestige to a place that in the 19th century had long been at Europe's periphery. While historians and wine experts have long treated the Ricasoli as the herald of Italy's political and enological modernity, my research illustrates that this discourse about the potential of Tuscan wines, like Chianti, is a much older one that stretches back to the 16th century, to a time when Tuscany was one of Italy's many separate polities, and its wines were really not particularly more renowned than those of other regions. Let's see if they are good. Although the economic benefits, both individual and collective, of making better wine would become an important part of this discourse, the discussion around making better wine originated not in the world of commerce, but rather from the world of learning. In the 16th century, authors of viticultural treatises encouraged their elite readers to consider taking a more active role in the viticultural and winemaking process by showing them how these activities fit into a much wider set of intellectual and cultural concerns, such as discussing the medical benefits of drinking good wine, creating and referencing elegant literary texts, both ancient and modern, and taking pride, of course, in one's good taste. These connections were necessary because, as we shall see, making good wine presented a considerable challenge and involved risks that, at least from an economic perspective, sometimes outweighed the potential rewards. These texts neither aimed to nor succeeded in immediately revolutionizing early modern agriculture, but they continued to be reprinted and read during the 17th century, when falling grain prices due to the availability of cheap grain imports from the Baltic freed up a great deal of land for viticulture in Tuscany and throughout Italy for that matter. As Tuscany produced both more and better wine in the late 1600s, Grand Duke Cosimo III, in collaboration with his court physician and noted man of letters, Francesco Redi, who we'll come back to later, shaped wine into a symbol of Tuscan excellence both at home and abroad. Cosimo shipped great quantities of his wine of his own production to rulers, aristocrats, and elites from London to Istanbul, and Redi published a widely acclaimed poetic dialogue of the region's wines called Bacco in Toscana, Bacchus in Tuscany, the Roman god of wine, that Cosimo sometimes included along with his shipments of wine. In this poem, which was written in Tuscan, a language that was both widely known and respected among the learned elite in the 17th century, Redi made clear, with his frequent allusions to Tuscany's achievements in the arts, letters, and sciences, that wine was a new branch of Tuscan excellence. Next slide. In the final decade of the 17th century, the outbreak of war between England and France presented an opportunity to convert this cultural capital into real profit, with the perennially thirsty yet vineless, at least up until recently, English nation embargoing its primary source of wine. In 1695, Lorenzo Magalotti, another Florentine man of letters and a close advisor to Cosimo, prepared a report assessing the viability of commercially exporting Tuscan wine to England, something that Tuscans had never before undertaken at a large scale. Indeed, for much of the preceding century, the transport of wine out of Tuscany was strictly prohibited due to concerns about shortages. The following year, Bettino Ricasoli, the great-great-grandfather of the inventor of modern Chianti, of the same name that I mentioned earlier, began exporting his Chianti wine from his estate at Broglio to England. And 20 years later, in 1716, the Grand Duke would convene Florence's most prominent wine families, of course, including the Ricasoli, to form the Committee on the Commerce of Wine to protect and promote this trade. One of the committee's first actions was to introduce a law demarcating and protecting the boundaries of the 4 wine zones around Florence, including, most famously, Chianti. Despite being one of the earliest laws of its kind in Europe, before I started my research, almost nothing was known about this group, why it existed, why it was formed, and its rationale for the laws it introduced. My dissertation uses the almost entirely unexplored correspondence of the earlier Bettino Ricasoli, that is the 17th century one, to piece together a narrative of this 20-year period during which Tuscan wine undertook its first foray into the international wine market. The Ricasoli's wine, which they felt was the finest in Chianti, if not Tuscany as a whole, was generally well received and managed to turn a profit, which was no mean feat considering the cost of transport and English duties. The family, however, encountered other challenges as well. Despite its reputation for traveling well, some of their wines arrived in England in subpar condition. And they also faced increasingly stiff competition from wines like Portuguese port, which emerged as a British favorite over the 18th century and could be sold for lower prices due to both lower shipping costs and also slightly lower import duties. The most worrying issue for Bettino, however, and as well as his family, was the growing number of inferior wines being sold as Chianti. It is unclear if these wines were imitations, adulterations, or simply lower quality Tuscan wines, but regardless, they all pose the same threat of damaging the reputation of Tuscany's wines, which for the Ricasoli was much more important than their bottom line. Around 1716, this crisis came to a head, and the family's agents in London reported that even good Chianti could not be sold in London for even absolutely bargain prices. It was shortly thereafter that the Committee on Wine would convene to regulate the export of Tuscan wines by eliminating any geographical ambiguities and compiling a list of all the wines made in Tuscany annually, organized by the maker, its relative quality, and its place of production. Unfortunately, Ricasoli's correspondence does not make clear whether any of these laws were ultimately enforced. That the family continued in the following years to export their wine, albeit in lower quantities, suggests that the collapse of the market for Tuscan wine may have actually fixed the issue they were trying to solve by leaving room for only the best of the best. However anticlimactic this may seem, these events would go on to have an important, albeit obscure, legacy in the late 18th century, when the newly founded Academy of the Giorgofili announced an essay contest for proposals to revitalize the export of Tuscan wine. The manuscript of the winning entry makes explicit reference to the early 18th century success of Tuscan wines in England and proposed a governmental body that had many similarities with the Committee on Wine. But in the printed version of this treatise, this reference is curiously omitted. One reason the author may have been hesitant to reference these events in a more public form was that they had taken place in the final decades of the Medici regime, which had ended when Cosimo III's son had died without an heir in 1737. The Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty replaced them as Tuscany's sovereigns and sought to promote themselves as liberal-minded reformers by portraying their predecessors as the Medici as decadent and backwards. And this, I'll talk about this more a little bit later. This is a kind of a motive that continues to live on, despite scholarly attempts to kind of push back against it. Whatever the precise reason, omissions like this meant that even as the conversation about Tuscan wine, particularly in terms of export, picked up right where early modern thinkers and winemakers had left off, their contributions fell victim to selective memory and eventually to genuine forgetting. The 19th century Bettino Ricasoli is proof of this. Despite having many of the same ambitions for his wine that he made on the same estate of Broglio, where his great-great-grandfather had made his prize Chianti over a century earlier, there's no indication that he had any knowledge of his family's past viticultural exploits. Former glory may not have been at the top of his mind for this younger Bettino, as when he inherited his family's estate after being orphaned at the age of 18, he found them in poor condition and weighed down by debts. Ironically enough, the elder Bettino had inherited Broglio in a very similar condition in the 17th century, and it's kind of a reoccurring family thing that we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, that I'm also kind of interested in looking into because the Ricasoli estate was sold off, not the estate actually, the wine in the brand was sold off to I think Seagram's in the 20th century, and they kind of ran the reputation in the ground. But the latest descendant of the Ricasoli has actually, I think early 2000s, late 90s, bought it back and has been slowly raising the reputation of his family's wines once again. Years later, when he made Broglio an agricultural marvel, this is the 19th century Bettino Ricasoli, and had risen to the rank of prime minister of the newly unified Italy in 1861, Luigi Passerini dedicated to Bettino a genealogy of his family that stretched back to their origins in the Middle Ages. The earlier Bettino is celebrated for his official positions and honors, but no mention is made of his interest in wine. Despite this, putting the latter Bettino's ideas about wine alongside those of his ancestors and of other early modern Tuscans leaves little doubt as to their origin. Indeed, when the 19th century Bettino retired in frustration from politics in the late 1860s, he returned to Broglio, where he had committed himself full-time to solving the problems that had plagued his ancestors' efforts to export Tuscan wine. That is, making a Chianti that could be shipped long distance without the risk of it spoiling. As with his early modern forebears, the stakes of this problem extended far beyond the wine market. For him, as with his great-great-grandfather, making good wine was a matter of personal honor, regional pride, and the well-being of Tuscany, and at least for this younger Bettino, Italy as a whole. All right. Making good wine was undoubtedly an elite project, but it relied on the uneasy cooperation of the contadini, the sharecropping peasants who worked the fields of Tuscany. The first generation of early modern agricultural writers advised their readers to ignore the advice of their contadini, the goal of whom they claimed was simply to maximize the strength and quantity of the wine produced on an estate. This claim seems plausible since the contadini were allowed to keep half the harvest in exchange for their labor. And of course, the wine was not just, something to enjoy, but a valuable foodstuff. The priorities of the contadini were in direct conflict with the prevailing knowledge about making finer, more delicate wines, which were supposed to be less strong and produce a lower yield. Later 17th century Tuscan authors encouraged landowners to take a more conciliatory and communicative approach toward their workers by arguing that happy contadini made for a more productive estate. It is difficult to gauge to what degree landowners followed through on this advice, But there are signs that increased interaction with the contadini had an impact not only on elites' approach to agriculture, but also their tastes. The chief evidence of this can be seen in the emergence of red wine from Chianti, which was described as full body and possessing a deep red color, as an increasingly popular and prized drink. Since antiquity, the prevailing medical advice was that white or lightly colored wines were better suited for elite consumption because they were considered more delicate. Red wines, on the other hand, were best for the lower classes who participated in manual labor because these wines were seen as much coarser and more nourishing. This kind of thinking, and kind of a good example of this, it's very rare that we find like sediment in the bottle, in red wines these days, but not that rare, but and usually that's a sign of quality. But anyway, back then, most of these the red wines had sediment from, the leaves of the grapes and everything. So it really was, it wasn't just earthy in color, but, almost earthy in taste. This kind of thinking was in part behind 16th century Italian authors encouraging their readers to make French style claret, which was closer to what we would consider a rosé today. These wines, both lighter in strength and color, were supposed to be better for the digestion, particularly for elites. Francesco Redi's ambivalent description of Chianti and Bacco in Toscana, excerpted and translated on this slide, illustrates both the existing rustic associations, the beverage, and how these ideas were in flux. He began by praising the wine as a robust drink for real drinkers, but then he complained of the Villanzone, which is already explained in the notes. And another fascinating thing about this poem is that the text of the poem takes up, under 100 pages, probably less. But the original edition of it had like 200 to 300 pages of notes. It was almost a joke that there was more notes than actual poem. And a lot of these were most of these are like linguistic because this is very Florentine to be very interested in the language and all the poetic references, but a lot of it was about the wine as well. But anyway, the Villanzone, who's the peasant from the hills, and really this translates perfectly into English as kind of hillbilly. The Villanzone, he complained of him the ruining Chianti by trying to maximize his yield, which, as we already saw, was a common complaint about the contadini. In the very next lines, however, Redi uses diametrically opposed language, majestic and regal, to describe a fine, aged Chianti. Somehow, Chianti's rustic reputation increasingly coexisted with this regal characterization, and just a decade later, the Ricasoli would claim that their wine was not just the best in Chianti, but also in Tuscany as a whole. They even boasted that it was as good as, if not better than, the prized wine of Montepulciano, which Redi had declared as the true king of Tuscan wine, and is still prized as one of the finest in the region and Italy in general to this day. Chianti as a style of wine ironically emerged not from the practices recommended by elite authors in the 16th century, but rather from their adoption of traditions of the contadini, whom they earlier criticized. I would like to transition to highlighting some of the arguments I make over the course of this narrative and how they intervene in different historiographies. The first and foremost is that the learned culture of early modern Florence played a pivotal role in shaping the discourse about the potential and value of Tuscan wine. This is not just because its literary academies like the Fiorentina and the Crusca, which were some of the first on the Italian peninsula, served as venues for viticultural authors to present their works, but also because the pursuit of making better wine in the early modern period was by its very nature deeply impractical from both an agricultural and economic perspective. It thus needed to be sustained by a much wider set of intellectual and cultural concerns, ranging from the medical benefits of drinking good wine to the personal and regional prestige of making it. Growing grapes to make wine was already a high-cost and high-risk enterprise, even though a successful harvest could mean a great profit. And pursuing better wine heightened this risk, since emphasizing quality meant de-emphasizing quantity. Better wines, in theory, meant higher prices, but even low-quality wines could readily be sold for good prices due to wine being a scarce yet vital foodstuff, and even spoiled wines could be made into vinegar or distilled into spirits. Perhaps the biggest issue was that there was no way to guarantee that the extra work and resources required would actually yield a better wine. Without a precise understanding of the fermentation process that converted sugar into alcohol, even the most skilled pre-modern winemakers could end up making flawed wine. Indeed, as I discuss in my first chapter, ancient agronomic authors like Columella, whose authority in many domains of agriculture was recognized throughout the early modern period, declined to discuss making good wine at all, not just because of the difficulties involved, but because he saw striving after wine, striving after what nature had hidden from them, not only as unwise, but also unnatural. In other words, a perversion of the virtuous mission of agriculture that ancient Romans loved. Early modern viticultural authors, even though they had a deep respect for these ancient authors, completely flipped this script. For them, striving after good wine became an ethical imperative. The viticultural expansion of the 17th century saw the pursuit of making good wine become gradually more practical and financially lucrative. And Cosmo's gifting of wine in the Ricasoli's export of Chianti moved this learned interest in wine, increasingly into the worlds of diplomacy and commerce. Here, too, the learned priorities that first led Tuscans to consider making better wine continued to guide their decision-making. When the English market for Chianti began to collapse in 1716, Ricasoli was worried not by the loss in profit, but rather by the damage to the reputation of his wines and the wines of Tuscany more generally. In fact, the Committee on Wine was formed to safeguard the reputation of Tuscan wine, the committee that was formed to safeguard Tuscan wine, resembled an academy just as much as a regulatory body. Half of its members were active in Florence's famed academies, and the list they sought to compile would have guaranteed the provenance of Tuscan wine in much the same way that the Accademia delle Crusca's vocabolario, the earliest dictionary of the language that would eventually become modern Italian, ensured the integrity of the Tuscan language. Many scholars have seen early modern Italian agricultural authors, with their emphasis on the literary and the learned, as the antithesis of the more engaged and grounded agricultural exploits of the 19th century, figures like Bettino Ricasoli. But my dissertation illustrates, far from being opposed to each other, these figures, sometimes literally in the case of the Ricasoli, shared a common genealogy. There are a few arguments that follow from this main one. First, the period of Tuscan and Italian history, this period of Tuscan and Italian history, which is to say from the mid-16th to the mid-18th century, has long been considered a historiographical backwater of sorts. For decades, even as the scholars who have claimed to push back against this narrative have contributed to it. Perhaps the most notable example of this thinking comes from the work of Eric Cochrane, who wrote a history of Florence that he referred to, in which he referred to this time as the Forgotten Centuries, with the idea that, his book was trying to push back against this, that these centuries should not be forgotten. But when he wrote of Lorenzo Magalotti, the author of the report on the viability of exporting Chianti, which I mentioned earlier, he wrote of him as a man without purpose, living in a purposeless age, which reinforces the stereotype of 17th century Italians as Baroque and decadent. My dissertation pushes back against this deep-seated tendency, not only by showing how learned figures did have a practical purpose, albeit one that took a long time to be realized, but also by highlighting how this period is connected to the events and discourses that came afterwards. The Bettino Ricasoli of the Risorgimento, this is the 19th century, when the unification of Italy, might have had no idea of his ancestors' viticultural exploits, but he confronted many of the same problems and was guided by many of the same principles as his early modern predecessors. Another contribution of my research is a reconsideration of the political and social roles of Florence's learned academies. Scholars have rightfully moved away from earlier accounts of these academies as being dominated by the interests of supposedly absolutist rulers. The way, however, that these academies were a forum for Florentines to convince their fellow landholding elites to make better wine, something that they saw as a matter of regional reputation and public well-being, illustrates that these spaces could also be ones to effect change, however gradual and modest. Yes, the rhetoric and reasoning they used to convince their colleagues was very different from that used by Enlightenment-era reformers, But when we sort through their language, their aims ultimately appear quite similar. The countryside where they sought to enact these changes was not something typically considered by the academies, which, being concerned with language and learning, were typically urban institutions. After the rise of princes and the decline of republican institutions in early modern Italy, there may have been less room for political action on behalf of elites in cities. But this was not true at all in the countryside, where their involvement in leadership could make a real difference. Academies then presented opportunities not for oppression and surveillance, but rather for political participation, albeit, however gradual. Finally, this dissertation has sought to put to bed another tired narrative, that of the supposed refeudalization that took place in early modern Italy, when early modern elites allegedly moved out into the countryside in mass and styled themselves as feudal lords on the model of Northern European nobility. The assumptions this idea relies on have been disproven again and again by scholars, but I think part of the reason that it continues to rear its head is that no compelling narrative has emerged to replace it. I think that early modern Florentines' intense interest in wine and agriculture provides an example of a story that could be used to do so, especially if parallel instances are found elsewhere. My research shows early modern actors going out into the country with new ideas and priorities as opposed to old ones. So I have a little bit about kind of what I want to do with this, but I think maybe this might be a good time to open it up to questions and we can go from there.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. And we might, if we have a bit of time at the end, talk a little bit about what you want to do with this, the second question. Um, we do have then a bit of time, well, quite a bit of time for a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand and I will let you unmute yourselves. Also, feel free to turn on your videos at this point. Does anyone have any burning questions? I see there's already a bit of a discussion in the chat. Um, while people think, I might start us off. I'm curious about the identities of these winemakers, both the elite and the contadini, throughout the period that you're thinking of. Are they almost exclusively or exclusively actual born and bred Tuscans? Do you have cases of either the contadini or the elites immigrating from other parts of the country, from other parts of Europe, other parts of the world to work on these in these vineyards, or is it actually purely Tuscan?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the short answer is I don't really know, just because these people, don't tend to leave records, especially, the workers. Um, my impression is that they are, that they were Tuscans just because this work wasn't lucrative enough for, people to come from elsewhere unless it was, I mean, maybe areas like, I mean, that would be something interesting to study too, is that, like there are, the area of Chianti like has always had vineyards. But there are, southern Tuscany at time, the Maremma was like, not very good. They hadn't irrigated it yet, or they hadn't improved irrigation. So there was like mosquitoes and malaria. So I mean, I think that there could have definitely been like, internal migration within Tuscany. But I think that these, it was still fairly close to, subsistence farming, I mean, at least for, once that they had given the half of their harvest for rents. So yeah, I think I mean, that is kind of an interesting thing to think about, like, did the peasants, or even like kind of the middle agricultural managers think of themselves as Tuscan really? I would think that their Tuscan identity was not super strong, um, whereas I think that, that's the interesting thing here. You have like, these Florentines, the elites, their Tuscan/Florentine identity is very strong. And really, I would even say the kind of regional, because Florence is very much the center of, the area politically and kind of a, a population center. And all the vineyards at the time are like in the immediate vicinity of, kind of Florence, or to a certain degree, Siena. It really is like, Florentine Tuscan, you can kind of conflate the two. Although there is the Siena thing is interesting because um, up until up until I think the 16th century, they were independent of each other, and Florence took over Siena. And when the Florentines set up their Chianti zone, they only set it up in like the Florentine, area of Tuscany. They didn't set it up in like what is called the Nuovo Stato, the new state of Siena, even though they were ruled, alike by the Medici. And there is this one. It's one of like the few letters we have like referring to the congregation of like the Sienese winemaker, this similarly elite Sienese writing like, hey, what about Siena Chianti? Like we profit greatly from using this title. And it's funny today because this kind of discussion continues about now there are like a million, not a million, I mean, but quite a few Chianti sub-denominations. There's the Classico, but there's also like the Sienese stuff. There's stuff around the hills of Florence. But yeah.
So just a very quick follow-up. The classic today, where does that tend to be from?
The classic tends to the Chianti Classico is like the very center of what is actually considered Chianti as a region, and it is the hills between Florence and Siena. Um, During especially, and I mean, it is very interesting, and actually, the what now is Chianti, not Classico, that is made, and it's now labeled more clearly. Like they have like to the west of Florence, they have like Chianti Montalbano, which is a region. It's Chianti style wine. It's not far from Chianti, but it's not like Chianti Classico.
Mhm.
Uh, it's obviously good, I mean, and they have pockets of Chianti that have spread around because, and I mean, especially in the 20th century, it was the same problem of people trying to claim their wine was Chianti, even though it was like really not made in what would be considered Chianti. And Chianti, I should just say, it has never had like demarcated. Obviously, they tried to demarcate boundaries, but it's not a political, unit. It's just it is really just like a geographic area. It's not really like, you know, there was like a league of Chianti towns. That's how the term emerged, but it was never it's always been hard to define. But anyway, some of these regions now that, I mean, I wouldn't never call it inauthentic Chianti or something, but it's definitely, the Chianti Classico folks don't consider it that, but they now have their own sub-denominations. And in fact, I have kind of a working theory that the other regions, the other three regions that I didn't mention, and if you know Tuscan wine, you might know some of them. Carmignano is the one that is actually popular, and that is actually its own kind of wine. It's very similar. Most Tuscan red wines are based on the Sangiovese grape. There is quite a bit of overlap. They're very proud about the differences, but my theory is at the time they were the distinction really wasn't important between those four different zones. They were just noted wine zones, and obviously the wine would be labeled as such from coming from that zone because it was a valued wine zone. I think that they were probably making the same kinds of wines, obviously not limited exclusively to these full-bodied reds that kind of the early predecessor of Chianti, but also to some degree white wines. But so the question of like labeling wines is a difficult one at this time.
Mhm. Wonderful. Okay, the question coming in thick and fast in the chat, really, but I'm going to start by asking if Kay/Graham would like to ask your question, if you're.
I'm here. Yep, thank you.
Yes.
I have a small video problem, but Teddy, that was great. Thank you very much. The question I wanted to ask was, how successful was Ricasoli in the late 19th century in exporting? From my work on the British market, Italian wine still had a very bad reputation. There's very little evidence that Ricasoli sold into the British market. What my understanding is that it was really only in the late 19th century when America got the Tipo Chianti, the straw-colored flask, the Fiaschi, that, what one historian has called a tidal wave of Chianti in flask hit America, and that greatly profited a lot of other merchants, but didn't actually do very much for Ricasoli. I mean, is there truth in that? You're nodding your head, but maybe that doesn't indicate agreement.
No. I know that is completely right. And I mean, I think it's really interesting that the earlier Bettino that I did most of my work on is unknown because he was actually far more successful in exporting his wine to England than, the later Bettino, who really, yeah, I mean, and he was like, like on the day he died, he had written like a little memo for like some ideas to like give some wine, give or sell at a discounted price some wine to a British exporter to have the wine get more known. But yeah, exactly. It didn't, the uneven reputation of Italian wine, persisted throughout the 19th century, and he was trying to push back against that. And where Bettino did have the 19th century, Ricasoli did have some luck was, I mean, there were many international fairs and festivals that he like presented his wine at, and he really did actually like he was able to like ship his wines as far as like San Francisco, like the Americas, and they also got shipped back and were still in good condition. So it was more of a kind of not theoretical, but more of like a proof of concept than an actual successful commercial
If I
venture.
can ask a follow-up, did
Yeah.
Ricasoli in his politician mode make any attempts to emulate what was beginning to emerge in France at the time, which was this sense of how do we protect names, and primarily at that stage through the trademark register. But the ideas behind the appellations were starting to emerge in that point. They didn't, of course, get finalized until much later, but the ideas are beginning. And I wonder if Ricasoli, as a politician, would have been uniquely well placed to get something like that through. Did he make any attempts? Is there any knowledge that you have of that? Apologies for late 19th century bias.
No.
I'll pop after this.
Yeah, no. I'm very interested in this part, especially after I had the chance. I finally had the chance last November to visit Broglio, and I had in fact a chance to meet the descendant of both the Ricasolis, and I think that one of the ways I might think about kind of doing this project, especially if it's a book that's because historians aren't so happy about a book that spans multiple centuries. That's changed a little bit, but I think that it's going to be a much bigger lift. But I mean, as a project for maybe more of a wide audience or something, I think that I'm very much more interested in the whole story. I don't quite know as much, but anyway, to return to your actual question about if so, I know that Ricasoli he traveled. He was in fact an ambassador to France early in his life and traveled there quite extensively and was very much interested in what was going on in, I think, Burgundy, maybe also Bordeaux. But he learned a lot of like enological information. And for example, in the late 18th, early 19th century, there was a lot of like there's basically a chemical revolution in terms of like they actually now understood the chemical process and how to facilitate that. He learned a lot in that regard, but I think that I don't know if he was aware of what was going on with that. I think that perhaps it might not come up in the kind of I've looked at some of the documents, the kind of stuff that other scholars have written about, and it hasn't been present there to my knowledge. And I think that he might not have written about it or been interested in kind of instituting that in a Tuscan setting because it was basically kind of so crisis mode. I mean, he was quite proud about his wines, but it's interesting. I don't know if this was his lifetime or immediately after his lifetime, but to distinguish his wines from the Fiaschi, the cheaper wines that got shipped that became increasingly popular in the United States, they didn't always describe their wines as Chianti. It was like they wanted people to think of it as Broglio, of its kind of its own thing.
Yeah.
So I think that for whatever reason, he might not have been so interested in that. And I think that the politics, and there is a scholar that has written, an Italian scholar that has kind of written about like the connection of his politics to his like agriculture and specifically his wine stuff. For him, the connection there was very much about kind of this like moral reform and kind of economic reform of peasants, in the countryside. It was interesting. I mean, obviously, it had a connection to commerce because bringing money in, that kind of thing. But I think that it's interesting that he wasn't. I mean, I guess what I should say too is that his emphasis, his way to address his primary concern for addressing this kind of commercial problem, or even the reputational problem, was of making, of engineering a way kind of to make a good Chianti. That's what he was focused on first and foremost. And in fact, actually, now I'm remembering he tried to get a little kind of consortium off the ground earlier in his life, before he kind of really got into politics, with some friends that were very interested in these questions. And he decided not to, because he basically just said Chianti has not been perfected yet, so it's not worth it to kind of get a consortium together to maybe come up with rules like that. I think that his emphasis was on the wine first, and so it is interesting. But I would love to know. I would love to look into if he was even aware of that. If that was on his radar or not.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna hold off on asking Maria's very interesting question towards the end of this discussion, because I think that's a different angle that we'll probably want to talk about a bit about methodology. A question from Tara in the chat. Can you tell us a little more about the 16th century authors of the viticultural treatises that you mentioned? The kinds of backgrounds, the ideas, the influences, something I was wondering about as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, this is something I don't talk a lot about in this presentation, but it makes up the bulk of the second chapter. It is really interesting because the identities, they're all, kind of men of letters of various stripes, and they're throughout Italy at this time. In the mid to late 16th century, there was a huge kind of outpouring of this kind of writing. It was very popular. It was spurned, in fact, by, kind of the reemergence of these classical texts that were being reprinted, retranslated, or even so lightly adapted. And if you're familiar with early modern writers at all, they'll just throw in a quote, like a paragraph or a page from Columella without citing it or anything. So lots of stuff like that going on. But the thing that's interesting, they're very much inspired by these classical authors. But as I mentioned, what the classical authors are experts on viticulture. They talk about, they really do. A lot of that knowledge continued, and I mean, to a certain extent, continues to be, quite valid in terms of growing grapes, especially from a efficiency standpoint. But they were not interested in winemaking, really. I mean, they included a few recipes, and they, just didn't even really talk. Columella even just says, he's like, I'm not going to really talk about quality, because it's just you just need to make the wine, it's going to sell. So that I have in my first chapter, I have, sorry to kind of getting away from the 16th century, but in my first chapter, I have kind of an argument. It's kind of a guess. I don't know if it's something that would end up in a published book, but my kind of guess is that and I think I actually talked about it, that it was unnatural to strive after good wine, because it wasn't, just there. Nature didn't give it to you. If you have to strive after it, it's unnatural. And Pliny talks about, for example, mining for minerals, diving in the sea for pearls is this unnatural, very unethical act, it's much more about the human side than it sounds almost like environmentalism. It really isn't. But anyway, these 16th century authors go this route of, they're much more interested in the winemaking. And the kind of overlap is really interesting, because in these treatises, they're not just talking about making wine. They talk a little bit about viticulture usually. Some of them just talk about winemaking. And then usually a lot of them are recipes for kind of making wine from scratch, if you will, with the actual grapes, all the way to well, how can you improve this wine that you have sitting in your cellar that's maybe a little bit past its prime? How can you blend it in various ways? So that's what they were really interested in, these kind of recipes. And it is kind of interesting too, from we were talking about kind of regional identity, that in this Tuscan identity emerges at the end, or not so much. I mean, I would say it doesn't emerge until the 17th century, at least vis-a-vis wine. But the early Tuscan authors, the late 16th century Tuscan authors, they were interested in making all kinds of different styles of wine, and they didn't even say that Tuscan wine was the best. They were really interested in Greek wines, which wasn't necessarily, and that's another thing with the period too, is that they'll say Greek wine, but it doesn't mean that it was necessarily meaning Greek style. I mean, and that was part of the problem with Chianti style. It doesn't. And in fact, they would include recipes, for example, how to make Bologna style wine in Tuscany. So there was kind of this cross regionality in them. And the kind of identity thing only emerges later in the 17th century. So I'm just trying to think if And so, yeah, they weren't primarily men of letters. Their agricultural backgrounds varied widely. I mean, someone like I worked a lot on the figures of Davanzati and Soderini, not really big names, but Davanzati, he got his treatise was really just kind of a translation or like editing of sorts. A guy that was much more of an actual agricultural background, lettered, obviously, so he not a peasant by any means, but someone that had basically been, an estate manager, not so much a landowner himself. Uh, for elite families. And he had written a treatise in Davanzati, and he's honest about this. He says, right in the dedicatory letter, he's just like, I translated this into better Tuscan, so we can enjoy it. So some of their work was like that. Someone like Soderini, who was kind of his colleague, writing at the same time. Soderini, he had an interesting background because he was exiled from Florence and put under house arrest in a country estate. So he was interested in botany. So he had kind of a technical background to write about this stuff. So all men of letters, almost without fail, agricultural background varied widely. But I mean, that was the whole point kind of, was that, oh, you don't have to be out in the fields to get involved in wine. You can just, you have to have a cellar for sure. You have to have some wine. But obviously, I mean, even that stretched beyond, if you could read, you definitely, had wine. Everyone had wine. So yeah, I hope that kind of addressed that question.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Dina in the chat, also echoed by Anne, asking about what kind of French wines, what kind of French wine regions, what they were offering during the same period, and who their trade partners were.
Mm. All right. Oh yeah, French wines. So the French wines are really interesting. And depending on, they were getting so the claret that I mentioned, they were very interested in imitating this, this kind of rosé-ish. It's much more, and if anyone knows Tavel, it's a modern wine style, but I mean, very storied. It goes back, to the Middle Ages. And it is this like beautiful salmon color. It's one of my favorite French wines. And in fact, it was something that I brought to this. I did a tasting after my dissertation defense. And if we were in person, I would have loved to have brought a bottle of this as well, because it's just the color is so brilliant. And it's unlike rosés, which are really just like modern, most dry rosés are like white wine with just a touch of, skin contact and just really a hint of some of the things you would get from red wine. This is really much more half red wine, half, I mean, it's not actually a blend of red and white wine, but it kind of gets you in between. And that wine was from the south of France, from the Rhone area. And so most of the Italian knowledge of French wine was very much shaped by, for example, the Avignon papacy in the Middle Ages. Basically, not only were these wines coming from when the papacy was based briefly in southern France, and not only did they bring back the wine itself, that continued to especially be popular in areas like Rome, they brought back some of the ideas, especially this making these kind of like lighter style red wines. Let me just what were all right. So, and yes, and what were, I mean, that's kind of the Italy France inner exchange. And obviously, for example, some of the Tuscan writers that write about wine, making good wine, they're like, we need to make good wine so we can stop paying the French, like we shouldn't be importing wines. And it was interesting, not they did, it was a doctor in the late 16th century. He didn't make economic arguments. He was like, these foreign wines are bad for us. They're bad for our moral character. They're bad for our health. Um, but so in terms of French wines that were popular, especially like in England, for example, like I think it was again claret. I mean, more so Bordeaux claret, Burgundy, of course. These were, these lighter style red wines, very popular both in France and, areas that they exported to. White wines were also popular. White wines had traditionally, as I mentioned, been the kind of, uh, drink of elites. It is interesting, right around the time that, Chianti is getting popular. In the late 17th century is when Louis XIV's court physician, previously he had recommended him to drink white wines because obviously this was kind of the traditional choice. And I think they do make the kind of transition to saying, and it makes a huge change in fashion, He did, it's like, oh, Louis, maybe you should drink, some lighter reds. And I think those were reds from Burgundy. Um, so let me see. that kind of addresses some of it. There is a lot about, I mean, out there. If you want to message me, I'm happy to send you some sources. There's a lot, like, French wine during this period has been quite well studied. Um, Also, Veneto is known for white wines. Were they providing superior white wine in this period? Some of these authors do talk about, they do mention some of the white wines from the Veneto, but I wouldn't say that they were particular. This is the problem too in Italy. I mean, the only kind of exchange you have of wine, like one of these great documents, is the letter written by kind of the sommelier of a pope in the 16th century, and it gives you the impression these are wines from all over Italy, kind of to a certain extent all over Europe, a lot of French wines. Maybe I'm not actually so sure about that. A few foreign wines, but mainly, Italian wines from all over the peninsula. But the only reason they were exchanged was as gifts. It's not like they were kind of available at the market. It was because elites were sending their wines that they had made to the Pope as a gift. Uh, so otherwise, there isn't tons of exchange. I mean, obviously, people, when Venetian merchants go somewhere, they do bring they bring their wine. They do sometimes bring their ideas about wine. So yeah, to kind of answer that, I don't know tons about the Veneto, wine production in this region during this period, and I think in part because they were drinking, most people drink their own wines, so yeah.
One final quick question about the specifics before we maybe talk about methodology. Dean also asked, is it possible to pass any blend of Sangiovese as Chianti?
Um, so not really. So it has to be. So I think base Chianti is, like the most basic, non-specified in theory kind of. I mean, it's not necessarily low quality. It's just the lowest bar to get that Chianti label to now. Um, Has to be 70% Sangiovese, or maybe 75. I don't know if they've changed it. And it still has to be made in certain regions. And then there's also certain rules about. I'm not an expert on like the actual modern rules about Chianti. I just know a little bit. Uh, there are also rules about what you can also blend in with those grapes. For example, I think Merlot can be a little overpowering, and you're only allowed to blend a certain amount with it.
Okay, I'm wondering if we can spend the last 5 minutes then talking a little bit about methodology. Tara asks, well, Tara's wondering how you came to your research topic, and then Mara is asking about, again, methodology, specifically looking at the letter correspondences in the archives, how you approach that kind of content, and if you have any other tips for PhD students looking at archival research.
Yeah, those are great questions. And how I happened upon this, it is kind of an interesting story. I did not go into grad school working on wine. In fact, actually, when it's a funny story, when I presented this research idea. Well, let me tell you what I worked on first. I worked on like 17th century history of science, like in Tuscany and around Tuscany. And you may know that Galileo was a Florentine, and there was a huge following of him after the fact. And so I kind of worked on these Galileo and kind of the cultural milieu of them. I was specifically interested in their interest in literature. You can kind of see that I'm very much interested in the language parts of this. And Francesco Redi was, really known more as a like naturalist or also a physician. And he wrote a lot about that. And also kind of considered himself a spiritual successor of Galileo, even though he worked on different things, but methodologically kind of. Um, and I saw this poem on Tuscan wine, and of course, I've always loved Tuscan wine. But I'm very much, I mean, still to a certain degree, excuse me, I still consider myself more of an amateur than an expert when it comes to, modern wine, although I've learned a lot in the course of this project. I came across this poem and I'm like, oh, it'd be interesting to write a seminar paper about this. And the more I looked into it, I'm like, oh, this is a dissertation. And perhaps that kind of, touches on the question of, methodology a little bit too, is I think, you have to, especially when you're early stage, graduate studies or wherever, I think being open to like, different, and I think that that's the other thing too that I talked a little bit about. I think that these things are very much, especially for early modern things. But I mean, I think this is probably true for a certain thing. Things are siloed, and like the only people that were really looking at Redi's poem were literature, literary scholars, and it was actually very much prized for that, and 17th century poetry is not really like 17th century in Italian literature is not really like a major century, but still, I mean, Francesco Redi gets a little bit of a footnote, but people weren't thinking about like, why is he actually writing about the wine? What's up with all these footnotes about the wine? So I think that the way I approach things, and I think that this comes from my background of like kind of working on the intersections of history of science and literature, is trying, piece together how these different sources speak to each other, even though like by our categories they're very different, Um, and I mean, working with letters was kind of that was kind of almost a departure. I mean, and that is one of the weird things about this dissertation is that these first three chapters are based almost exclusively on like textual sources, like things that have been published. And then towards the end of the third chapter, in the entire fourth chapter, it shifts into like archival sources. And I mean, my committee pointed it out, like this is a little, it's not bad necessarily, but so I'm still very much thinking about like, methodologically, so I'm kind of I think I'm most comfortable with textual sources, but the archival ones, I was kind of drawn into the archives. And I guess my recommendation there would be too is like I benefited from, I went to I've gone to like a few paleography things, even, and the paleography helped. I will say that 17th and early 18th century paleography it's not, I mean, it's much easier to read than like medieval stuff. Um, but going to like archive, so the Medici archive project, and I know this is very narrow for people that are working on Florence, but being aware of these things, and like the Medici archive project offered a like archival seminar, and it was actually like cost $1,000. It was kind of, for me, I was able to get some funding, but it wasn't an investment, but it really paid off in terms of like the kind of not only the skills, but kind of just like the ideas of the people that know these archives. I think, and it is just like, learning what is in archives and thinking about kind of like what else could be in there. And I mean, I benefit, well, it's both a challenge and a benefit for working on the 17th century is that it's very understudied, so there's lots to find, but there's also like for example the finding guides and everything, they, what am I thinking about, the things that the cataloging is not great for this material. And in fact, I think the picture that I had uh, of the stuff in the archives, one sec. So yeah, this is from the Archivo di Stato in Florence, and you can see how they were just like tied together with this top twine that I don't think anyone had looked through them in a while. And in fact, as I looked through them, the archivists would come and like retie them in better ribbon. And of course, they were like concerned that I wasn't putting them. I'm like, no, I've kept them in the best order as I can. They're not in order, but I've kept them in order. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, I'm trying to, let me just read that question again, methodologically. So what are some other tips? Yeah, all right. I think I kind of covered that at least as much as I can. So I just be open to things, you know, especially things that seem crazy. I mean, and that, I think that's what I never finished that part of the story, but I was really actually concerned about, I was writing this, my first like stab at this project was writing a grant proposal for it. And, I was like a little bit scared to show my advisor because I'm like, oh my gosh, this sounds crazy. It sounds too crazy to like do a Tuscan wine project. It sounds, because, Tuscany and wine are obviously so associated. And it's like, to the point that it's cliche that I'm like, oh boy, this might be an uphill battle, but fortunately, I mean, my advisor was very supportive, even though, like the history of food was not really what she worked on. And that is also one of the interesting things about it. And it's great to talk to a food studies group because like none of the people really on my committee were like food people. So, I kind of had to look elsewhere for that. So yeah.
Great. I think that's a really nice note to end on. So thank you everyone, first of all, who's attended. It's been really lovely to have such an engaged group of people. And of course, that's a lot of that is down to having such a fascinating presentation. So thank you so much for joining us, Teddy. Thank you for taking your time, sharing some of your work with us. And I think we're looking forward to hopefully seeing some publications on this
Yes,
work.
yeah, hopefully. And I will tell you, I I was put in touch with this group via a friend that's in Oxford, and I'm definitely going to come and visit him sometime over the he's on a postdoc there over the next, the coming academic year. I'll definitely come, and I would love to have some wine with whomever is there, that's part of this group that's based in Oxford. So I'll be in touch, and feel free to share my contact information with anyone. I'm happy to answer questions about this, or however minor or major. So
Thank you so much. That's very generous.
thank you all for coming and arranging this. This has been lovely.
Okay, I think we will end there and hopefully stay in touch.
Yes, definitely. I would love to. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you again.